Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Welcome to our traditional end of the year podcast, where we take a look back at 2021 and all its craziness, and also take a look forward at 2022. And joining me for this will be Deb Maue, marketing expert for The Change Leader, who will take over her traditional role as host while putting me on the hot seat for a change. Deb, I think I should say welcome to the show, but here I'm the guest, So
welcome to the show, Drumm.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I've been looking forward to this for a year.
Me too. How are you?
I've been doing great. It has been one crazy year in higher ed, hasn't it?
Well, it's been a crazy year in general. And yes, also in higher ed.
I begin to wonder, is it crazier in the world or in higher ed, or is it just is higher ed a reflection of what's going on in the world?
All of the above. It's hard to believe that we're back here again. It's hard to believe. I say that every year. It's hard to believe it's been a year since we had this conversation, but here we are, late December.
Yes, and it's crazy. It's been crazy. This is our 101 episode.
Wow.
So, yeah, we had 100 last week with Dan Greenstein, who is the chancellor of PASHE.
Yes.
Great conversation. They're doing some super things there. And a lot of what they're doing is being driven by market forces.
Well, as a native Pennsylvanian, I've been following that story closely, and very interesting, the changes that he's been pushing through there. So that's great. I look forward to listening to that.
It's a great episode. And, Dan was just a wonderful guest. This last year, 2021, I think that's the year. I'm not sure.
I think that's right.
Yeah. It's been a year of coronavirus. It's been a year of politics. It's been a year of innovation, really innovation born out of necessity.
So how did you, so every year we make predictions. So how did you, let's first talk about how you did on your predictions from last year. So the first one was that the COVID vaccine was going to be a game changer.
Well, I would say that it certainly was. It was a game changer, except then Omicron came along, and now there are schools that are actually shutting down early, Cornell being one of them, a few others, because they're concerned about the breakthrough infections. Go figure. But yeah, it was a game changer. It allowed folks to come back into the classroom like they meant to be. Not everyone was really ready for online education, not only faculty and institutions, but students. So it did change. We'll have to see how that happens going forward. If, the vaccines continue to be effective against it, if it's far more virulent than the previous strains, Delta included.
Right.
But initial reports say that it's less deadly. There we go. Except for unvaccinated people.
Right. It does seem like the vaccine has allowed us to get back to more normal on campus. And even though, to your point, we're seeing temporary shutdowns, I think we're seeing, 1 week, 2 week shifts to remote learning rather than the 6 week, 8 week, month-long shutdown that we saw before. So that's a good thing. That's a good thing.
Yeah. We also, prediction last year, higher ed needed to develop partnerships with businesses and stress the concept of lifelong learning. And we definitely are seeing more of this. We'll talk about that and some of the institutions who are doing that. But I would say folks are following Michael Crow's lead at Arizona State about lifelong learning with current students. Enrollment drops. Yeah, we've seen more and more enrollment drops. Graduate education, frankly, was the only one to increase. And some of the predictions I'm seeing is that may not last. So
it seems like the coronavirus has accelerated the enrollment declines and has, whereas before we were talking about the enrollment cliff coming in 2026, feels like to some extent it's here now, and particularly with the community colleges.
Absolutely. And, it's kind of strange. People had expected the enrollment in community colleges to bump up with free community college, and it had, or it looked like it was going to. But then when that got cut out of the Build Back Better plan, I have some serious concerns. Are community colleges going to be able to weather the storm? Does it need a full reorganization to what their mission is? Some of them are moving to 4-year degrees. Is that the right way to go? I don't know at this point.
Yeah, I think there was an expectation on a lot of people's part that with the COVID shutdowns, there would be a lot of students transferring from 4-year institutions to community colleges because, they didn't want to pay the price of tuition and be fully remote. But that didn't happen. Very interesting. Really counterintuitive, I think.
It is, and especially with so many people being hurt. I can't help to wonder if all the monies we threw at higher education through the CARES Act and other things, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, if that didn't help students stay with those universities.
Right.
Because so many universities were passing money directly to students.
Right. I think that's a good point. One of the other things you predicted was a shift to online learning. So talk a little bit about how you did on that one.
We've seen that, obviously, with the shutdown when, higher ed said, we don't know what's going on here, so we're just going to shut things down. Now, the question really is, did it stick? And I think the biggest impact with that was on faculty. Faculty knew they had to shift, and they did. And a lot of the naysayers went, this isn't so bad. We can still be the sage on the stage if we really want to. But I don't think it had the large impact that it did, except for those megas, your Purdue Global, your SNU. You've seen some acquisitions with people thinking it's going to happen, like University of Massachusetts system purchasing Brandman, which was Chapman University's online. You saw University of Arizona purchase Ashford. So you're seeing some purchases, mergers, acquisitions along those lines. I think it's a wait and see, but Purdue Global had its first profitable quarter or year. I can't remember which it was. Just recently they announced. So that is moving in the direction that it needs to.
I think that during the shift to remote learning, I think people got a lot more comfortable with online learning. I think, to your point, faculty got more comfortable with it. I think a lot of students got comfortable with it. And so I think that more and more it's being seen as an option. So not necessarily caused a whole lot of people to say, I'm going to take my whole degree online, but it caused a lot of people to say, maybe I'll take an online class here and there mixed in with my on-ground classes. I know at my own institution, we were very anti, traditional undergrad students being able to take online classes. That's shifted now. So we're allowing students to take one online class per semester if they want to, and then more in the summer if they want to. So there's just a lot more flexibility now, and it's just being seen as another modality, another option for students.
As it should be, because you should be able to bounce back and forth between on the ground, hybrid, and online. And many institutions make it difficult because of pricing courses differently. It's in a different college, so you can't do that, etc. I think we'll start to see, here's a prediction for next year, I think we'll start to see a little bit more ubiquitous learning experience across the various modalities.
Agreed. You also predicted that the mergers would continue.
Oh, and they have.
And the closures.
And they have as well. Going back to the CARES Act and the other funding, I think it delayed what's the inevitable. You and I were chatting before we started the recording today. Higher ed is in a mature to declining market, and you are going to have mergers, you are going to have closures, failures, things along those lines. And one of the folks you were talking about, has just written about that.
Yeah. It's interesting. Art Levine's new book about disruption in higher education and the prediction that higher ed will go the way of the film industry and the television industry and the music industry, where because consumers have the power now instead of the industries, we'll see the same kind of shift. I think it will be interesting to see how much that plays out. Certainly, we're seeing some of that already with Google and other players who are new to the higher ed industry offering courses, badges, certificates. So it will be interesting to see how that affects the industry.
Well, it's interesting. You bring up a point about different offerings, not only from Google, but Amazon's doing it. We had a podcast earlier this year with Tony Wuta, who is the provost at Howard University. And he talked about how they're having a partnership with Google and with Amazon Web Services to help their students in their degree in a practical application of what they're learning. I think one of the big challenges that we're seeing is how accreditation is either helping or hurting institutions with their ability to innovate. If you're required to do stackable certificates or certificates or whatever, but your degree programs, if industry still requires a degree to come in, are you teaching the applicable things that need to be taught? I mean, with Ashley Finley, who comes from AAC&U, they did the liberal education background. They did their annual survey, and teamwork, critical thinking, these type of things are what industry wants out of graduates. How are we teaching those things in a degree program? And in fact, is a degree program what they really need to be successful? I don't think that question's answered yet.
I don't think it is either. And to your point about accreditation still rewards the time-based system of learning. So certain number of credits, credit hours, certain number of semesters, certain number of weeks in the semester. It's all time-based versus competency-based. And I think we're seeing employers saying, I don't care how long it takes you to learn how to write. I just care that you know how to write. And so that's the other thing that's happening with this shift from industry control to consumer control. It's the decoupling of education from this time-based system. But the accreditation still rewards the time-based system. So to that extent, accreditation is hindering the ability of institutions to really innovate and meet the market demand.
You're absolutely right. Certain check boxes that you have to do with accreditation. And let's get into more of that as we go through some of the topics.
Okay, great. So, Drumm, you did very well on your predictions, I would say. A+.
Not bad. A-, I'll take.
All right, A-. We'll give you an A-.
But you do work for a university, and one of the problems is grade inflation, isn't it?
That's right. All right. All right. A- to a B+.
Okay, that works.
But let's look back over the year and what actually happened. What were the trends that we saw for the year, and kind of where are we right now?
Well, I don't need to talk about coronavirus anymore. I mean,
no, we're done talking about that.
We're done with it. It may not be done with us, but
right.
We touched on this in the predictions. There's a lot of money that's been sent to higher ed, through the CARES Act, et cetera. And one of the challenges is it enough money? Okay. The Build Back Better is going to have somewhere between 70 and 100 billion going to higher ed. Is that what's needed? Or is that going to be an incentive to go back to the old way of doing things versus the innovation?
Isn't the other question really, is the money being used in a way that's creating sustainable change or sustainable programming that's actually meeting consumer needs? Or is it just putting a Band-Aid on things?
I think both, actually. I think a lot of money, at least in the first couple of rounds, has gone to students where it was definitely needed. It allowed students to continue on with their education. I mean, we've seen quite a number of students drop out. I saw unbelievable figure that the number of high school students who are delaying going into college, I can't remember the percentage, but I was pretty shocked by how much that has dropped out. The institutions needed help. Now, the question is, and we'll touch on this, I think, when we get to the shared governance portion, how much of this is faculty driving and institutions there to stay what it was? In a mature, declining market, you have to make market changes. How you offer things, what type of things you offer. How many institutions are putting advisory boards of people who hire your graduates, putting those in place and allowing them to guide, what curriculum needs to be taught, what's taught in the curriculum? There aren't that many, actually.
Right.
And so, we have to be careful with all this money that's out there, that people don't use this to just put a Band-Aid on the issue. They need to use the money to make some whole-scale innovations. And
right.
I mean, we've seen a lot of institutions out there doing those very things.
What are some of the things that you're seeing?
Well, for example, the cost of higher ed is Michael Polyakov and Armand Alekbey from the American Council of Trustees and Alumni put out a report called The Cost of Excess. And in this, they found the only way to improve graduation rates, which really that's the gold ring, that's right. What you're looking for, is increasing instructional spending. At public institutions, they found it was twice as effective in improving graduation rates versus increasing the administrative spending. We've got to be looking at things like that. And, with the high cost, inflation over the last year was 6.5%, year to year. In higher ed, it was about 2.5%, 2.3%. But it's still expensive. And Matt Scoggin, who comes from an investment banking background, he's a new president at Hope College. They've got an initiative called Hope Forward. It's a pay it forward model based on generosity and gratitude. That they've worked the numbers, and they don't have a ton of students there. They're not, 10, 15,000, but they've worked the numbers to where if they can limit the number of students and they build up their endowment to $1 billion, that they can pay for everybody's education going through. I mean, these are some of the things that I'm seeing that it's like, wow, that's really an innovation.
Mm-hmm. Really, really helping the students.
Absolutely. There was another person that I spoke with, Billy Hawkins, who's the president of Talladega College. He said it perfectly. When crises hit, you have to prioritize your students. Mm-hmm. And if you're thinking about what's best for students, you can't go wrong. Mm-hmm. You can't go wrong.
You predicted last year that there would be continued closures and mergers and partnerships, and probably didn't see as much of it as we would have without the government funding. But did you see more activity in that area? And if so, where did you see it? Did you see it more in closures or in mergers or some of both?
Actually, the acquisitions, the mergers, tipped it by about a 3-to-1 scale. But There were some significant closures, all smaller colleges, religious-based colleges as well. There were 3 of those that happened over the last year, either, did close or in the process thereof. 10 mergers, acquisitions, some pretty big names, actually. Mills College was acquired by Northeastern University. Marymount, California is being acquired by St. Leo's out of Florida. Claremont School of Theology, Willamette. I'm sorry, I pronounced that wrong. It's
Willamette.
Willamette. It's like, damn it, Willamette.
Right.
That's how somebody told me to pronounce it. Yeah. Remember, they've been quite active. Not only the Claremont School of Theology, but the Pacific Northwest College of Art are being merged or acquired. So there is that stuff going on. Had it not been for the CARES Act and other federal stimulus funds, we would have seen far more.
Right. So we'll probably see that increasing even more as the government dollars go away.
Absolutely. And, a couple that I'd mentioned earlier, the building out of more offerings, the building out of different deliveries, University of Massachusetts system acquiring the online arm from Chapman University, Brandman, seeing University of Arizona acquiring Ashford. Now, those are kind of interesting, especially the Ashford one, because it is a nonprofit acquiring a for-profit. And just like the way that the deal was structured with Purdue Global and Kaplan, selling price of $1 and then a cut of revenues going forward. Creditors don't necessarily like that. The Department of Ed doesn't necessarily like that, but it's, what's happening. They've got to figure out a better business model for those kind of acquisitions and mergers, but it's going to happen. There was another one that closed this last year, and that was Goodwin University's acquisition of the University of Bridgeport. And it was one other player with that as well. Now, that one's kind of interesting because it was supposed to be absorbing all the programs, all of the real estate, et cetera, and it's a nonprofit acquiring a nonprofit. Well, what they ended up doing was having 3 standalone entities that share backends, they share services, they share programs, so students can go back and forth. The new president of that, Danielle Wilkin, is doing an incredible job there of redoing the culture, what they call the new UB, the new University of Bridgeport. She's doing a fabulous job with that. But those are some of the things that we're seeing with this merger activity. It doesn't always go the way that people expect it to, but if it's done in the right way, and I know I've had a couple of other universities approach me to help them through merger process when they get ready to do it. So there is the appetite out there, especially coming from the boards. Some institutions have gone the non-traditional way of having a board of trustees. And many of those institutions, because they've got people on their boards who survived the 80s, survived the 90s, and all the reorganization and the restructuring of the industry, they're looking at all of this restructuring within higher ed in a very different way. And I think this is a very welcome way. The only thing is to be able to get accreditors on board with some of these innovations.
Well, you would hope that people will be more and more open to mergers and acquisitions, because it's certainly better than the alternative of just having to close down completely. Better for students, better for faculty, better for everyone.
It should be, but it's change. And we, the devil we know versus the devil we don't know. Most people, and especially faculty members, are very risk adverse. And to go and do something like this, I mean, we talked about Pache and the merger that was going on, the Pennsylvania State system of higher ed. The big thing that came out of that, and they had to go through the legislature to do this. The big thing, the transparency with all of this, the reporting out to the different stakeholder groups. That's the thing, is if you can engender the trust in one of these transactions, it certainly will help be able to move things in that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Drumm, with this accelerated enrollment decline that we've seen as a result of COVID, you would hope that various factions on campus, staff, administration, trustees, faculty, see the need to change and rally around that change. Are we seeing that to a large extent, or are we seeing the opposite, which is politicization? I can't say that word. I can say willamette, but I can't say that P word. Are we seeing more of that?
Well, I think nobody wants to say that P word at this point in time. It is unfortunate. Yeah, we should be focusing on the students. And I think many boards think they're doing that. There is the, free speech movement and et cetera, et cetera. I think the one that drives me the craziest is we've seen much more whatever the word is, more politics in higher ed.
Politics.
Critical race theory. I mean, critical race theory came out of a framework for legal analysis back in the 70s and early 80s, saying that race is a construct, social construct, and that racism isn't just a product of individual bias or prejudice, but it's something that's embedded in legal systems and in policies. They've studied, sociologists, literary theorists have studied links between political power, social organization, language, and the ideas have formed from other areas as well. The academic understanding of critical race theory is very different than the way it's being represented in politics right now.
It's become such a lightning rod.
It is. And so what you're getting is many, got to call it like it is, many red state governors and legislatures are trying to outlaw CRT being taught in the classrooms. Now, this is going to end up becoming a free speech issue, government restriction of speech. I mean, when you take a look at, the Bill of Rights, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Now, it specifically says Congress, okay? But depending on whether you're a strict constructionist or an originalist on the Supreme Court, does that apply to state legislatures? You're going to have some people say, no, it doesn't. But I suspect it's going to end up getting thrown out. The question is, that is a long time away.
Mm-hmm.
And it's gotten kind of crazy. University of Florida attempted to prevent faculty from testifying in a court case around state voting rights. Well, this didn't really fly too much because there was a Florida International University president who was okay to do it, but he previously testified the way that the Republicans liked when it came to redistricting and, all of that political stuff that goes on. Well, University of Florida has gotten themselves in just a little bit of trouble because SACS, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges, will be sending a special evaluation committee to the university to determine whether the institution exhibits significant noncompliance with the accreditor's academic freedom standard. We're starting to, yes, accreditation can help you, and it can, not
it's
be
all
your friend.
Just such a distraction from the important work that really needs to be done. And there's bigger work that needs to be done, more important work that needs to be done.
So much. But I mean, if that wasn't enough for the University of Florida, someone who is campaigning against Governor DeSantis recently made an allegation that he's been pressuring university trustees to donate $100,000 to his campaign in order to keep their seats. And Business Insider, which is a publication down there in Florida, reported at least 9 current trustees across Florida donated to DeSantis's 2022 campaign. So, it's either through them, through their personal accounts, a business, a spouse, but there is that thing. Some people will hear me say, America is the only country in the world where bribery is legal. I mean, it's like, you can't make this stuff up,
No.
folks.
No.
But I mean,
No.
even University of North Carolina, the whole Nicole Hannah-Jones issue with tenure and her 1619 Chronicles. This whole problem with UNC started more than a decade ago when the Republicans claimed the majority in the legislature, and then they started filling the UNC system governing board with like-minded individuals. UNC is an interesting one because it's the legislature who appoints the trustees for the university.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so you have one majority in the legislature, and you start to get, when you have things like that, you start to get into, are the trustees fulfilling their fiduciary duties?
Right.
Duty of care says they need to be loyal to the university. Well, if your appointment comes from someone else, where's that loyalty? Is it really with the university, or is it with the person appointing you?
Right. So we're seeing some unfortunate behavior on the part of trustees. What about faculty? Are they doing what they should be doing? Focusing on the right things?
Well, sometimes, but this whole disruption that we've seen with COVID has brought out the best and the worst in some people. I mean, you saw faculty really pull hard to convert courses to online and things like that. But now, and it's not just faculty, it's everybody. We've been doing this for almost 3 years now. People are exhausted mentally.
I think it's only been 2 years, but it seems like 3.
Well, when did all this start?
2 years ago, December of 2020.
Was it 20?
I'm sorry, 19, December of 2019. Yeah.
Well, yeah, so that's,
No, but it does seem like 3.
It seems like a lot longer than 3. It seems like at least a decade. But you see in faculty, they're tired, they're burned out, they've been asked to do so many different things. They've had budget cuts. And you've seen a lot of faculty governance coming up with votes of no confidence. I mean, there were 16 in 2020 alone. And this last year, Penn State, University of West Virginia, New Mexico State, Michigan, both Western Michigan and Eastern Michigan. I don't know what's going on there in Michigan, but it's certainly interesting. Rutgers. I mean, those are just a few of the bigger names. There's quite a number of smaller ones. I go back to the comment that I made earlier about PASHE. It never would have worked if there hadn't been the transparency. And so I'm kind of wondering, it's not like administrators lose 20 points of IQ when they get promoted from faculty ranks.
Right.
But people aren't being informed of the necessary changes. And then when they start to affect them, it's like, well, yeah, we don't have any confidence in this leadership. Sometimes the board buy off on it. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes there has to be a fall person, like what happened at New Mexico State. The provost was put on leave of absence. Faculty don't always get a say into who gets promoted or who is put into administrator positions. It's been a long time, if ever, I've seen a faculty senate get fired because they recommended somebody for a promotion. That person got it, and then the person didn't function. They were ineffective. It's the president of the university, it's the provost, whoever's doing the promotion that's held accountable. And faculty governance, one of the challenges with that is you don't have someone who is accountable for decisions that are made.
Right.
So a lot of things going on for sure.
So let's talk a little bit about cost and student debt, cost of education. What are the trends you see there? Is it continuing to get worse and worse? Have cost increases slowed?
I think they have when you compare them to inflation. Higher ed was 2.3. It's still too high. We've got 1.7 trillion in student debt. You've got student loans being starting repayment back in early 2022, and there's no indication that the Biden administration is going to delay this any further. The large number of student debt is significantly impacting graduates' ability to live life. Mm-hmm. And it's driving other sectors of the economy as well. We're seeing home purchasing, even though the housing market is just on fire, up 16% from last year. But you're not seeing a lot of folks, college graduates buying a home. They're having to wait. So it's significant. And this, kind of goes into admissions enrollment. Mm-hmm. You've got the enrollment cliff coming up. Enrollment is down in multiple areas. Students, many of them can't afford the college education without a debt. And what they've seen because of their parents, what they experienced in the Great Recession and other places, they're just saying, I'm not going to take on that debt. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because I was listening to an episode of the New York Times Daily podcast, and they were talking about the fact that things are moving in the right direction, right? Unemployment is low. Wages are going up. So by the traditional objective measures, things look like they're good, but people don't feel like things are good. Mm-mm. And that's this huge disconnect right now, is that because of the continued uncertainty around COVID, because of inflation, because people are tired and they don't know what's coming next, people just feel very uncertain. And I think that translates to unwillingness to shell out a lot of savings or take on a lot of debt for higher ed.
Mm-hmm. And it talks to risk behaviors. Mm-hmm. People are unwilling to take risks. They're afraid. They're mm-hmm. burned out. They're afraid. They don't know what's coming. When you read a headline like we had, yesterday or the day before, that 73% of all new COVID cases are Omicron. Mm-hmm. It's like people are going, and the vaccine, if you've had 2 vaccines, it may not protect you. Mm-hmm. It's like, what's next? People are tired. They're burned out. They just don't know.
Right.
But rather than dwell on this negative stuff, it's all, and it should be looked at as a path to innovation. And we
never let a good crisis go to waste.
Absolutely. You've heard me say that so many times. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that. We, mentioned, Tony Wuta there at Howard University. A couple of my favorites, Philly Mantella, the president at Grand Valley State University, and Russell Lowery Hart at Amarillo College. They're 2 institutions plus 4 others, Shippensburg State, San Jose State, Boise State, Fort Valley State. They've started something they're calling REP4, Rapid Education Prototyping for Equity Change Communities and Learners. It is a model for innovation. They're trying things. Edison, he's known as the innovator. He says, mm-hmm. if you want to succeed, learn to fail faster. Mm-hmm. So they're trying things. They're working together with this group of folks, and they're bringing some really interesting things. I mean, Philly was, when we were talking a couple of months ago, they have done market research with prospective students. What do you want in an education degree? How can we better serve you? And they're implementing those type of things. Russell Lowery Hart with his market research, talking about knowing who your student is, not who you want that student to be. I mean, everybody wants, somebody who would qualify for Harvard. Well, guess what? A lot of institutions don't have that. They called their prototypical student Maria, typical 25, 27-year-old Latina, maybe working 1 or 2 jobs to pay for her education. How do they support that particular student? I mean, stories like this are just to me, amazing. And it tells me about the type of people we have in leadership positions in higher ed who they truly are innovators if they're given a chance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Roger Hughes, you maybe never heard of that name before unless you follow college football. Roger Hughes was the head football coach at Stetson University. He built that program from scratch. He also was the head football coach at Princeton. His new job is not head football coach at Doane University, it's president at Doane University. Mm-hmm. The man is an incredible leader. He's been coached by Jim Tressel, who was the head football coach when one of the Ohio State University, when they won the national championship back in the early 2000s, and he's been a very successful university president for 7 years. So Roger Hughes, the transition from head football coach to university president, proving how critical leadership is for innovation. Kim Hadley at John Brown University, doing incredible work with risk management. I mean, they developed 8 different scenarios to take to the board when COVID hit. They did precautions like doubling, tripling. Actually, it was even more than that, their line of credit, because they didn't know how much they were going to need. They looked at different ways to improve their cash flow. They added in new terms when they had to delay the start back till February of early this year. They threw in what they called the J term, the January term. Quick online, let's get one course, nail it out. Faculty bought in. They were, glad to do it. Melek Khoury at Unity College. They have no committees. They have just task forces, and they use the RACI model. Responsible, accountable, consult, and
one of my favorites.
Informed. Yeah. Mm-hmm. This is and they've got an atypical. They and Stephen Standiford at Bradley University, atypical boards for higher ed. I mean, Bradley's board, they are making some huge changes. They have got a results-driven board. They don't have any academics on the board or traditional academics. They have people from industry who drive results. I mean, this, I can keep going on and on. There are so many great examples out there. Mark Lombardi at Maryville. Deliberation has nothing to do with time. I love that because if you're doing good, Dwight Eisenhower, strategic plans are nothing. It's the planning that's everything. Mm-hmm. If you're having those conversations in your planning process, it's very easy to come back to say, oh, we talked about this in the planning. This is a good direction. I mean, you talk about excellent results. Mark Lombardi at Maryville, which is a decent size independent institution, nonprofit, they've had a $1 million plus surplus for 14 years running. That is taking care of business. Mm-hmm. You've got to run it like a business. And some presidents have told me they were raised in a family of business people. So they look at higher education as a business, and you've got to do that. So those are just some of the shout outs that I wanted to give.
I heard Nathan Grau from Carleton College speak a few weeks ago, and he talked about the fact that boards need to identify what those third rail issues are, the issues that nobody wants to talk about, and they need to talk about them on a regular basis. So there can be no topics that are off limits because they have to talk about the stuff that nobody wants to talk about.
They have to. And this is part of the reason why it's so critical that the relationship between the president and the board, and especially the president and the executive committee, there can't be any barriers to that. You've got to have those hard conversations, and your board's got to be appraised of everything that's going on. That old saying, nose in, fingers out, is good to a point, but the role of boards is changing in that you've got to be oversight for the institution, but you've also got to be able to be a consultant to the president and give him or her advice, maybe when it's not even solicited.
That they don't want. Yeah.
So,
All right. So now you're ready for predictions?
yes.
Okay. Give them to me. I'm going to write them down. Hold you to them.
So we're going to continue to see enrollment drops. Maybe we've started the enrollment cliff already. You already mentioned that. We're going to see more hybrid and fully online models. I think students like that. We're going to see far more traditional higher ed institutions, and we're going to see far more of a transition to certificates, badges, stackable certificates, micro-credentials, those type of things. We're going to see far more of those, and we're going to see more partnership with industry to make sure that they get what they need. I hope I'm wrong, but if the Build Back Better doesn't get the significant funding, it's going to spur more innovation, which is a good thing, but it's probably also going to accelerate closures, mergers, things along those lines. Unfortunately, I think until after the election of 2024, I don't think midterms are going to have much of an effect. But until the presidential election in 2024, I think we're going to still continue to see politics influencing higher education until something is done in the Senate with respect to voting laws. We're still going to see this. And it's not just Republicans, it's Democrats as well who are trying to stack state legislatures and redistricting and all that. One vote should be one vote. It shouldn't be stacked up. But that goes against the majority of the way people think, at least in legislative office, whether you're Republican or Democrat. And I think higher ed, until we start to see some movement with accreditors with respect to innovation and faculty governance and things like that, I think higher ed institutions are going to continue to struggle with innovation.
Agreed.
So
Agreed.
Those are the predictions. I hope I don't get myself into too much trouble by doing it, but
we'll go easy on you. Well, I hope you have a lovely Christmas and New Year's, and it's been great catching up with you and great talking about all of these interesting issues. It's why we stay in this industry, right? Because it's so interesting.
It is, it's like the Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times.
Right.
So, Deb, it's always a pleasure to catch up, and our best to you for happy holidays and a wonderful and prosperous new year.
Thank you. You too, Drumm. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Stay well.
Thanks for joining us today, and a special thank you to Deb Maue for her usual hosting excellence. We've had a very interesting year in 2021, one for the record books. And if 2022 is anything like this year, we're in for a humdinger. This was episode 101, and it's been a great ride over the past couple of years, getting to meet so many great guests, too many to mention. And speaking of guests, I want to take a moment to recognize a very special guest, you. We've had so many positive comments about the podcast, but they wouldn't be special without you and your willingness to listen and send me some great ideas. Thank you. So here's to 2022 and our being able to welcome so many more pillars of higher education to the show. And to you for listening. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, and the best for a happy and prosperous new year.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.